Okay, Maurice, I see we have already some people joining us. Currently, we have 32 participants. I would suggest we wait maybe just a few more seconds and then we can get started.
Thank you.
Okay, please go ahead, Maurice. I think we're good.
That's great. Thank you, Sergio. So good afternoon, Europe and Africa, and good morning, Americas. Maybe good morning if we still, good evening if we still have some colleagues from Asia on the line with us today. It's getting later, I believe. As Sergio suggested, let's slowly kick things off here because we have a panel of very exciting guests ready, waiting for you to start this webinar. So welcome. Thank you all so much for joining this virtual meeting. Today, it's the second webinar in a series on the importance of diversity and equal opportunities in a healthy R&D environment. So the current event is a collaboration between the IFPMA and Hyper. I guess most of you on the line will be familiar with the IFPMA, maybe Hyper not so much. So Hyper is a network of young professionals in the pharmaceutical industry. We're dedicated to empowering, connecting, and mobilizing young leaders and future decision makers in the life sciences industry. So Hyper was set up in 2020 in the middle of COVID, but we've been working hard on the road trying to grow, to extend our reach, reach a bigger audience. So I would definitely invite all of you on the line to follow us on Twitter, like us on LinkedIn, and hopefully we'll be able to engage with you with a lot more content into the future. So as we kick things off, just a couple of practical housekeeping things before we start. So we're going to be running the session today without visual support of slides or video, just to really allow for that authentic interaction with our guests today. We have a chat functionality where you can put your questions throughout the session, and hopefully with the help of Sergio, we'll be able to bring those questions to our speakers. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand and you can ask your question live. Just good to note that the session today is going to be recorded, or it's already being recorded. So by raising your hand, by asking a question live, you're consenting to be part of the public recording that will be available through the IFPMA website after this. So who is this guy? Who is me? Maurice Hameleers. I will be your moderator for today. Just to say a short couple of words of introduction about myself. So I am affiliated with Hyper, this initiative. I'm also working with an IFPMA member company with UCB here in always sunny Brussels. I'm passionate about figuring out what makes the world tick. And that's also why I'm here today. So I'm working as an organizational project manager, previously worked as a public affairs expert, but I'm only saying that to emphasize that I really have no functional experience working on clinical trials or with clinical trials. So I'm really looking forward, together with hopefully the people that we have joining our session as guests today, to be learning from our expert panelists through the conversation that we're going to be having. So together with the other young professionals in Hyper working in the field of health, we're looking ahead and we want to contribute to the well-functioning of health systems into the future. And we're going to do that today by shining a light on an area that we think really requires our attention and even intervention. So this is the area of diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. So in today's meeting, we're going to be continuing on the conversation that started in a webinar 2 months ago on the 24th of March, also on diversity and inclusion, but focusing then on workplace and organizational culture. So that webinar of 2 months ago is also publicly available on YouTube and can be found through the IFPMA website under their previous events for those of you who are interested. So in that session, we had one speaker, Sharon Olmstead, and already in that session, she mentioned that it's so important that when a patient comes into a clinical trial site, that there's a staff member there that they can associate with. somebody that understands them or that maybe even looks like them. And this was already one of the ways in which the diversity, the internal diversity of the pharmaceutical sector translates into potentially diversity of patients enrolled in clinical trials. So in today's session, we're going to be digging a bit deeper into that. So we're going to be shifting what we did back then from an inward view on diversity and inclusion in the R&D sector to a more outward one. And we're going to be looking at the most fundamental area of interaction of the industry with patients, which is clinical trials. So clinical trials, they remain an essential tool in assessing the therapy's safety and efficacy. And a lack of diversity here translates to insufficient knowledge on how a therapy may affect an underrepresented group or people or a group of people, how it affects them differently. So some examples of underrepresented groups may be ethnic minorities, maybe sex, maybe an age group, etc. But we're going to be getting into the details of that with our panel in a short bit. So in my personal work, I've seen actually that the implications of a lack of diversity can be quite profound, and even more so, that we see indeed that some populations may be difficult to be found. And as a result of that, the evidence that we have of how the medicine works on them may be insufficient as well. And it goes further than that, because maybe when we're looking at rare diseases, which is what I'm working on myself, is that the clinical trials that are being conducted are sometimes the first really rigorous research efforts into these new disease areas. And if we're not reaching those patients, that means that we maybe just not be understanding diseases of entire subpopulations, that we're not able to understand their diseases, not able to even diagnose them. And these people will go undiagnosed their whole lives. And I had a very compelling example of a patient that gave a testimony to me quite recently. And she had a neurological condition. And the condition that she had, they failed to diagnose her with it because it's generally associated with old men. This was a young woman. And as a result of the failure to diagnose with what she had, she ended up being put in a mental asylum with some vague diagnosis of hysteria. And I really felt that this lack of understanding with us, with the healthcare industry, can have such a profound impact on the patient's life. It's really heartbreaking. So there's a clear challenge here and a need for challenging the status quo and to ensure that there are safe and effective therapies for everyone tomorrow. So in today's Hyper IFPMA session, we're joined by 3 panelists who will take us on a journey to explore the different solutions that there are to this problem. So you're going to be hearing from 3 experts who are working every day in their own way to make clinical trials a little bit more representative. I hope that they will help us to pinpoint the consequences and the real harm that there are to a lack of diversity, but also take us along in their journey that they're going through, what they're doing to improve this diversity in the trials. So I'm hoping for everyone who joined us on the line that this will be an inspiring session, that you'll be learning something, and that it might also be a practical session for you, that you can take the learnings from today into your own day-to-day work and really amplify the impact that these people with us today are having on making clinical trials a bit more diverse. So all the panelists, we're already having you on camera. That's great. Maybe we can do a quick round of introduction. I'm going to be going chronologically as I'm seeing you here. So our first panelist today is Dr. Mary Norkady. And Mary, you're a director with Pharma, the US industry representation of the Pharmaceutical Trade Organization. I see you're a director for clinical trials, diversity, science, and regulatory advocacy, and you're leading the Diversity in Clinical Trials Initiative. Welcome, Mary. Do you have maybe any words of introduction yourself?
I think you did a great job. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Mary. So next I see we have Dr. Frances Catherine Kevenko. I see you have a really impressive track record in holding academic positions at the National University of Singapore, the University of Zurich, before currently joining Russia's medical affairs team, the global medical affairs team. But you're also sitting on as an executive committee member on the Women's Brain Project. Welcome, Frances. Would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Maurice, for the nice introduction. You've summarized everything perfectly. Just wanted to say I'm very excited to be joining and very happy to be here with Mary and Keith. Thanks.
Thank you, Frances. Great. And then our third panelist is Dr. Keith Dawson. So Keith, you're the principal science leader in global health equity and population science. I think the title was a bit longer, but it was really a mouthful. So maybe you can help us understand what that means exactly in a little bit, working at Genentech Roche. So you're leading clinical development and medical evidence generation. And this is in the context of indeed getting more representative studies for Rush. Is that right to understand your role?
You said it better than I could. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today.
Fantastic. Welcome. Well, thank you all three so much for being with us today. So I think with this, I would love to jump into the panel discussion that we have for today. I'm going to be having a couple of questions for all of you. I definitely also encourage all three of you to maybe react to each other, ask each other questions, because I think we're going to have a nice dynamic with it. You've got such a profound insight into this area. I think we can have a really interesting discussion around this. So I would maybe like to start with you, Frances. Could you maybe reflect for us, what's the impact of a lack of representation in clinical trials on our understanding and use of medication?
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Maurice. So maybe just to add a little bit of context. So I kind of wear two hats. So I'm in the pharmaceutical diagnostics industry as a medical affairs manager, mainly focusing on neurological disease and Alzheimer's. But then I also sit on the Women's Brain Project, and there we really focus on sex and gender differences and how this hasn't been taken into account in different steps of drug development in clinical trials, and also further down the line in how it impacts the patient. And you can see many different examples of how this can actually streamline down towards not just phase 2, phase 3, but also what happens with the patient in the end. It was very striking, for example, the story that you told, Maurice, in the beginning about a patient that you'd spoken to, because actually one of our patient ambassadors at the Women's Brain Project, Sophia Peterson, she struggled to get a diagnosis for over 5 years, mainly because she was a woman that tends to perform a little bit higher on verbal memory tasks, for which women have higher resilience. And because her performance was really high, it was difficult to diagnose her. And so she went from physician to physician. And Alzheimer's disease is really one of those neurodegenerative diseases where trying to get it as early as possible, getting an intervention as early as possible is really, really crucial. So this is just one of the examples that really demonstrates how much it can affect the individual in its core. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's.
Yeah.
I
didn't know if I should go.
And
yeah, sorry, Maurice, it's lagging for me. That's why.
That's a great example indeed of how this impacts patients at the very individual level. I'd be curious to hear. So you mentioned you're sitting on the board of the Women's Brain Project. Can you tell us maybe a bit about the work that the Women's Brain Project is doing?
Sure, happy to do so. So the Women's Brain Project, the headquarters sits in Switzerland, but it is an international nonprofit organization. It was mainly founded by a small group of scientists a couple of years ago, and some medical experts that were really focused on brain and mental health. And ever since then, it's really exponentially grown. So now we cover many different disciplines and fields. So we have medical doctors, we have neuroscientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, those in pharmacy, as well as communication, and even people who work in the regulatory space. And now we've accumulated many different projects. So we tackle, I would say, 3 different pillars. So we work on building evidence, on expertise, and awareness. So for evidence, what we try to do is we address missing evidence gaps, really trying to generate data showing what kind of differences could arise from sex and gender in different parts of patient milestones. So for the patient and also earlier stages as well. So in like phase 2, phase 3. And then in terms of expertise, we have many different experts from different fields who really focus in looking at sex and gender and how these effects are prominent within their own scientific field of research. And we offer consulting in this, as well as some education. And this is where it ties into then the awareness piece, where we spend a lot of our time and resources educating different types of audiences about the effects of neglecting sex and gender in different aspects of drug development, in developing diagnostic tools, and also the effects that this has on the patient and caregivers. And in that respect, we also work heavily with many different stakeholders, so patients as well as their families, caregivers, policymakers, as well as other scientists. And the main goal is that looking at sex and gender differences through this lens would be a gateway towards moving from, the standard of care, which seems to be more kind of one size fits all, shallow medicine, what we call it, to a more precision medicine approach. Because of course, there are other aspects to diversity, and sex and gender is just one of them.
Thank you for sharing that. And then I understand that you have a personal sort of interest or experience specifically in Alzheimer's disease. So could you maybe talk a little bit about how the work you've been doing here has maybe changed the field since you started working on it?
Yeah, actually, it's been quite an eventful couple of years, I have to say. And I'll go back to when I first discovered the Women's Brain Project. I was still a PhD student at the time, and we were at a retreat. And one of the co-founders of the Women's Brain Project was actually present. She was part of my lab, and she had presented a wealth of evidence demonstrating sex differences in Alzheimer's disease, biological as well as differences in the performance in neuropsychological tests, such as I outlined with our patient ambassador at the time. And I found it particularly striking. And what was even more striking is at the time, this was a retreat where we had, kind of the godfathers of the amyloid hypothesis, many different influential key stakeholders in the Alzheimer's field that were very much resistant to hearing this kind of talk. And now it's very much changed. Actually, one of the professors that was even there collaborated with the Women's Brain Project on a paper. So it's really changed a lot. We've also started to have some presence in terms of workshops, roundtables, symposia in many different conferences in the Alzheimer's disease space. And it's also getting a lot of traction. I mean, regulatory bodies themselves have actually even recommended that for clinical trials, you need to really look at representing the different minorities. This includes sex and gender as well as ethnic minorities as well. So we've taken a lot of step forward. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Frances. I think with that, I'd like to maybe move to one of our next guests. Keith, you've joined us today also to share a bit of work, share about a bit of work that you've been working on with the IFPMA on diversity and inclusion in clinical trials through a set of principles. Could you maybe start why you think that diversity and inclusion in clinical trials is important?
Yeah, thank you. I fundamentally think that diversity and inclusion in clinical trials is important because all patients should have the opportunity to benefit from advances in science and research. And that's really not the case today if you look at our clinical trial demographics. It's not representative of the baseline epidemiology of disease in general. And that's where the opportunity is when you think about like the patients that we enroll in our clinical trials and the evidence that we generate. It enables us to then answer, the scientific efficacy and safety questions that are really important for all patients, not a select subset of patients, which is really where we are today.
So could you maybe elaborate a bit on when you say certain subsections of the population are not well represented? So is it sort of clear where this is coming from and how this is what this looks like?
Yeah, if you look at clinical, well, I can speak a little bit about Roche clinical trial data, which I think is somewhat reflective of trial data in industry overall. Overwhelmingly, when you look at the patients that are enrolled in our clinical trials, around over 90% of patients are patients with European ancestry. So it's not really representative of the global diversity, racial and ethnic diversity of people that live within the world. And I think that the reason for that is multifactorial. And And what we need to do is have a multifactorial approach for really creating strategy and tactics to make sure that the patients that we enroll in our clinical trials really reflect the baseline epidemiology of disease, reflect the populations of patients that ultimately will receive our medications in the real world. And I think what we have right now is like there's really a data quality gap. If you're not collecting data on representative patients, you may not have all the information you need to have at the time the medication's approved that the drug works in all patients that ultimately will receive it.
That's super interesting. So could you elaborate a bit on the work that you're doing with Rush then to try to address this issue?
Yeah, so my current role is I'm a principal science leader in global health equity and population science. And our remit is really looking at working with our clinical development colleagues across Roche to look at like the current state for our clinical trial demographics, with the goal of having our clinical trial demographics to be really reflective of the baseline epidemiology of disease. So my focus is driving strategy and tactics for clinical development and evidence generation. So we're really focused on working with teams to have a plan, to have a strategy for, it's like, this is what our current state looks like for clinical trial enrollment. This is what the epidemiology of disease looks like globally when you look at incidence and prevalence data, and really to have a goal to make sure that our clinical trials become more reflective of the epidemiology data. And what I found in working in the space of the last 2 years, it's like there isn't one simple thing that you can do to solve the problem. It's a complex issue, and it requires a complex strategy in order to address it. And that's what we're doing every day. So we've also have decided that we need to really have a focus, and really to focus on those disease areas where we know that there is very high prevalence of disease in African, Latin American, Asian patient populations. And where we also know that there is data that shows that there are differences in outcomes for these patient populations. So we've really have focused on prioritizing disease areas where we know that these disparities exist, and really working very closely with our clinical development, clinical operations, clinical science colleagues to formulate a strategy so that we can actually move the needle from where our current state for clinical trial demographics to where we need to go. And I think Maurice might be frozen.
I think you're right. But on that note, since there's a pause, I was wondering if I could add something to what Keith said. It's a really interesting point, and I really wonder where the balance is, because I completely agree we should reflect the epidemiology. This is also something that we see very much within Alzheimer's disease. A lot of clinical trials don't actually represent the population in terms of sex. But one of the big boundaries that we've been struggling with ourselves at diagnostics is getting the right representation in terms of recruitment, because it could delay recruitment of clinical trials and might delay the whole trial. So I don't know if we'll find a solution today, but how do we strike a balance in getting the clinical trial going, getting the recruitment going, but really trying to keep in mind that we have a diverse representation?
Thank you,
I
Francis, also for jumping in there. My internet cut out there for a second, but actually I had a follow-up question very much in the same vein, because Keith, I hear you saying that, you know, it starts with having a strategy. It's about having that awareness and the intention to wanting to address it. And then next is, okay, it needs to be a multifaceted approach. But would you be able, Keith, to give us, maybe to lift the tip of the veil of that multifaceted strategy or the tactics that you have to actually move that needle? So what are you doing different now than maybe back when you weren't when your role didn't exist, if it's possible to say such a thing?
I think there's probably three things that I can highlight. It's like, one is when you look at site selection, and you look at the patient, we need to, like, if we want to change our outcomes, if we want to change the demographics in our clinical trials, I think it will require us to do things a little bit differently. So if we continue to go to the same sites that we've historically have gone to for enrollment for our clinical trials, and if you do nothing else, you're most likely to receive the same outcomes and see the same demographics. So part of it is like leveraging data for like going to where the patients are and geo-targeting sites and investigators that have the demographics for the patient population for a disease area of interest. And sometimes that might mean that you're moving away from some of the academic sites that we've historically engaged with over years, and you may need to develop new relationships with new sites, community investigators, who may require additional resources and support to really set them up for success, for enrolling and retaining patients in our clinical trials, because we want high quality data at the end of the day, because we want to have approval of our medications. So one is, I think, site selection. Two is really looking at the clinical protocol itself. When I was writing protocols a few years ago, sometimes what you do is that you copy and paste eligibility, inclusion, exclusion criteria that you've used from a previous protocol into the new protocol that you're writing. It's kind of lazy to do, but I'll admit I've done it in the past. And there isn't like a lot of like thought and intention about, it's like, so what really is the reason for this eligibility criteria? And now thinking about it, are there potential like barriers for this criterion that may have a negative impact on certain racial and ethnic groups from enrolling in the study? And like, is it really like a safety issue for this criterion, or are you just pulling it through because historically it's something we've always done? So having that conversation, having that thoughtful review of the eligibility criterion, thinking about the outcome that you want for the patients that you want to have to ultimately enroll within the clinical trial. And I think the third big thing is really partnering with external experts, including the voice of the patient. Especially when you're thinking about going back to that protocol and looking at the protocol from a patient's perspective to see if there are potential like barriers within the protocol that may be preventing them from enrolling. Like, do you need as many in-clinic visits that are listed in the protocol in order to like really ultimately determine the safety and efficacy of the molecule? Because some of these additional visits may actually be barriers to patients who need to, drive to the clinic, pay for parking, have childcare taken care of. Like, are there other ways that we can collect these data, or do we even need to collect these data to really do the assessment of the molecule that is needed?
Thanks for sharing that, Keith. And those are some actually really practical points and actually implementable lessons that are that we can use to move the needle here. But I am wondering though, I think some of the examples you mentioned are about supporting the sites better or going the extra way to make the trial easier on patients. Those are maybe also interventions which would raise the cost of conducting a clinical trial. So how does that barrier of cost sort of weigh into the reason why companies are or maybe are not doing everything they can to get a trial sample representing the actual patient population?
I think when you think about cost and timelines, I think there's some myths that exist around diversity and inclusion of patients within clinical trials that may not actually, when you look at the data, be the reality. So there's one example I can share from Roche experience. So we had a trial that was specifically looking at racial and ethnic minorities with COVID-19. So we had a dedicated trial to really to go to where the patients are, to identify new sites for enrollment. I think historically the thought was it's like, so if you're engaging with new investigators, it's going to take more time, it's going to cost more money. And if you're going with new investigators, that there may be issues with data quality. For this particular study, the IMPACTA study, we actually found the opposite. The timelines came in quicker because we were very targeted for the site selection. We went to where the patients were for the sites. So it took less time for the investigators to screen and enroll patients for the clinical trials, for this particular clinical trial. So the timelines actually came in shorter than our typical study. So shorter timelines is actually then shorter. I mean, it's less cost as well. And it just required us to do things different. What we also found was that the screening process took a little bit longer than our historical data. But although it was a longer runway for screening, at the end of the day, timelines were pulled in. So I think it's important, as we for focusing on diversity, inclusion of patients in clinical trials, that we also collect data around the impact that this is having on timelines and budgets and resources. But really the focus is the ultimate outcome. What we want to achieve is that we actually have quality data that is reflective of the patients who are ultimately going to receive our medications. And which makes me think just a little bit about from the guiding principles for that, and some of the work that Roche, as a member of the clinical trial diversity work stream, worked with the IFPMA to develop a set of clinical trial diversity principles to be a resource to the biopharmaceutical industry when they're thinking about their strategy and their tactics for increasing clinical trial diversity.
Thank you. And I'd love to get back to those principles in a little bit. First of all, such an eye-opener to hear you talk about the fact that actually it might be a time saver and consequently a money saver to be doing this right, which is I think a huge incentive for everybody to look critically at the studies they're running and to see if they're doing everything they can indeed to get those representative samples. I'm mindful that we had some questions coming in through the chat already, and I'm going to be getting to those in a little bit. But first, actually, I also want to maybe direct a question at Mary. You've been with us from the start, but I haven't gotten around to introducing you because Keith just came up with so many interesting topics that I couldn't stop myself from asking follow-up questions. But you've come here with the perspective from pharma. Can I just maybe ask, what is pharma doing and what are you doing specifically in this area of clinical diversity?
Yeah, so pharma has been involved in the clinical trial diversity discussion for quite some time. Here at Pharma, we have done everything from creating our own clinical trial diversity principles that we wrote and adopted in 2020. And that really addresses many of the barriers to clinical trial access. And so we are providing that not only within pharma, but to many of our member companies as guiding principles on how to conduct clinical trials. And so that really just helps individual member companies really think about strategies to really address a more diverse clinical trial. In addition to that, we also had a clinical trial diversity workshop that was conducted last year, 2021. We had over 500 stakeholders. So we really wanted to get the voice of the communities, underrepresented communities, to really understand their experiences with clinical trials and their impact on their communities of not having that access. So many of the individuals at the stakeholder workshop included not only pharmaceutical companies, but patient organizations, patient representative groups, legislators, FDA officials, as well as academic institutions. So what we heard from many of these communities is that the barriers to clinical trials has a large impact, but it really starts from the inability to access clinical trials within their own communities. So it's very similar to what Keith had mentioned, and that not only developing sites that are well established, but ensuring that there are sites in those specific underrepresented communities where patients can have access to clinical trials, but also education to clinical trials, so that when the time does come around, they are aware of the resources in order to access clinical trials. And just on a personal note, I had a friend whose mother was diagnosed with cancer. So a few years ago. And one thing that she had a lot of trouble with was navigating the system. And so one thing that we would like to kind of shift that paradigm from where clinical trials are parachuting into communities, conducting trials, and then pulling back out, but more of a sustainable infrastructure so that members of the community can have access and understand where to go in order to get that clinical trial access.
That's so interesting. So indeed, the clarity for the patient how to get into trial. So what can you maybe put a bit more detail to what pharma is doing to help with getting patients to find the trials that they might be helping them?
Yeah, so pharma, we don't specifically conduct clinical trials, but we do help really understand the landscape for our member companies. So what we did was put together principles that really outline many of those barriers. So one thing that we heard time and time again was the lack of access in communities. The second barrier was what you had mentioned earlier, is that sometimes when individuals enter clinical trials, they don't see anyone who looks like them or really understands some of their cultural backgrounds. So that need and that trust in that community needs to be fostered through more diverse clinical investigators. Another aspect that we really saw was some of the points regarding education and understanding clinical trials, because oftentimes we think about clinical trials in underrepresented communities and we remember some of our past historical experiences, which have not always been positive. So really changing that paradigm so that individuals can build that trust and understanding so that they seek clinical trials when available. But the one thing that we really wanted to address with not only our principles, but our workshop was that access barrier that many of these underserved individuals do experience when trying to get access to novel drugs through clinical trials. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I love that you bring up the topic of trust, because it's so important, I think, for every modern business almost in today's world to build that trust with the community that you're active in. So could you maybe talk a bit more about how pharma and also your member companies would go about building that trust with the communities that have been traditionally more difficult to reach?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that trust is that underlying clarity in clinical trials. I think oftentimes underrepresented communities have been left behind or only pulled in when trials were not always to their benefit. So really to help provide education, be kind of a staple in the community, in the healthcare systems, so that when it doesn't come down to when a patient is sick to access clinical trials, but they're aware of the resources prior to getting sick. So making sure that you're known within the community and well ingrained, and it's a sustainable kind of framework to conducting clinical trials. And so that's kind of the paradigm shift that we are trying to kind of help influence the landscape to move towards.
That's great, and I'm sure that it's a lot of work to get there. I'm curious, and I'd love to ask this question to you, Marie, because you have such a, you're so close on this topic, and you know so much about sort of how this is developing from an industry-wide. Could you maybe look into the crystal ball and think, okay, so this is what we're doing now to improve. What is it that in 10 years from now we're going to be looking on to even bring us a step further?
Yeah, I think like perhaps looking into the crystal ball, I mentioned a little bit of shift in that framework is more so building really a sustainable framework or infrastructure that would be present in communities that are underrepresented at all times. And so it's not always going to be a in and out type endeavor for clinical sites, but again, similar to what Keith had mentioned, but mentoring novel sites in communities of color and underrepresented communities to ensure that they have access at all times. That's as far as the crystal ball that I could peer into. I'm sure there are many other aspects that I could touch upon, but I think that would really help push this initiative forward.
I mean, I could maybe speculate if we look some decades ahead, that if we're really advancing with personalized medicine and we're also able to design personalized trials, that the whole issue of clinical trial diversity is a non-issue anymore, because maybe every drug would be tested at a personal basis. Or am I being too optimistic?
It's not really my area of expertise, but yeah, I think that is where we are moving towards, personalized medicine. So I think diversity in clinical trials is a key foundation to advance in those areas, because I know in many oncology pipelines, personalized medicine is where we are moving towards in the future.
Thank you. So I've loved this initial discussions that I've had with you. In the meantime, I want to sort of also open it up a bit further for the audience. We've already collected some questions in the chat. So to our audience, please keep the questions on coming, and also feel free to raise your hand if you're willing and daring to ask the question live to our guest. So I'm going to be starting with the first question that we received from Aditi, who asks, why does discrimination exist? I think that's a broad question, maybe beyond even the topic of clinical trials, but maybe if we narrow it down a little bit to the fact. So Keith, for example, I remember that you said that if you look at the Roche trial, 90% of the participants have that European heritage or the European ethnic background. So why is that even the case right now?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is like, what is your goal for the strategy? For like, I think that in the last 2 years, there has been increased focus for diversity and representation in clinical trials and our data. And I think there's also been increased attention from regulatory authorities on the need to have representative patient populations. When you think historically for clinical trial drug development, the focus has been primarily time, speed, getting the trial done as quickly as possible, and so that you're like be first to market for the drug. And I think like where we are today is it's really it's an and. It's like speed and time is still important. And we want to make sure at the time of that submission to regulatory authorities that the trial is representative of the target patient population from a racial and ethnic demographic perspective.
Thank you. Francis or Mary, if you ever feel like complementing an answer, please feel free to do so. I'm seeing another question from Freya around the barriers to implementing more appropriate demographic profiles. I feel like this has been covered in the conversation we had so far, but Freya, if you want to narrow that down or follow up with a more specific question, then that feel free to add that to the chat. I'm seeing here a question from Jacob Wested, which I'm finding very interesting. I don't know if you can also see it, but he's asking, when we discussed the rights to representative clinical trials, should we also discuss obligations? For example, signing up or signing up your child to a clinical trial if they have a certain condition. So how do you find this can be done in a meaningful and constructive manner? I'm opening this one up to the floor, whoever wants to take that one. It's a tough one, I understand.
Can you repeat the question?
So we've been talking about the rights for patients to have representative clinical trials, but should we also talk about the obligations for signing up? If I'm interpreting the question correctly, should we also talk about the obligations to sign up yourself or to sign up or somebody depending on your child, for example, to clinical studies to be able to get representative samples to studies? And I'm guessing this is more relevant to more rare diseases, for example.
Yeah, it sounds like it's more about the personal responsibility. Because I think it's like when I was like reflecting on like the IFPMA clinical trial diversity principles, because they're really a set of statements that are really like tied to the principles of bioethics, justice, fairness, beneficence. And I think like, so the principles, we approached it as like we as IFPMA member organizations, what is our responsibilities as a biopharmaceutical company? But you can also, I think these principles also would apply to the individual, because like you believe that you have an ethical obligation to participate in research because of fairness, and you want to make sure that the clinical trials data is reflective of all patients. So I see, even though the IFPMA clinical trial diversity principles were really focused as a guiding tool for industry, I think that these bioethical principles are also very applicable to individuals for their motivations for participating or not. I wonder what others think.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty tough question. And in the context, the greater context of what we're talking about regarding diversity in clinical trials, we have to understand that and this is just a personal opinion, but some of our past histories, at least within the United States in conducting clinical trials, some individuals were not always given that opportunity to consent to clinical trials. So we have to tread very carefully when we think about an obligation to have individuals participate in clinical trials versus participants volunteering. So it's a very interesting question. I think it would be a huge ethical discussion, but definitely something that we would tread carefully on when we think about diversity in clinical trials.
Thanks, Mary. I noticed that, Francis, that you put something in the chat there. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, sorry, thanks for opening the floor, Maurice. I just wanted to add to the previous question before about the background for discriminations in terms of kind of a lack of recruiting enough females in clinical trials, especially reflected in in some neurodegenerative diseases. One of the main reasons that a lot of experts have pointed to was this tragedy in the past with thalidomide. So it was prescribed then for morning sickness at the time, and unfortunately it caused a lot of birth defects and the death of many babies at the time. And so in a kind of movement to protect females, there was a bit of I think a shift and a resistance to recruit females in clinical trials because of this tragedy as being one of them. Of course, it's not the core reason, but it was one big motivator.
So what's necessary, Francis, maybe to move beyond that and to ensure that we have medication that is in fact appropriate for those specific populations? Is there specific attention, sufficient attention for that in the field of clinical trials at the moment?
Unfortunately, I still don't think it's there. I mean, we're doing quite a lot in the Women's Brain Project, and there are certain other groups as well trying to raise awareness about this. I think one of the biggest gaps is that in like phase 2 and in the phase 2 trials also, there's not an adequate representation of female sex. I mean, one kind of prime example of how this snowballs is there was, I think a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2019, right before the pandemic, the FDA approved an HIV prevention medication that was only approved for men because there was no single female included in the trial. And these are things that we really should avoid. And we're really trying to do this by raising awareness on where the gaps are. And this is also, what we are trying to look at and analyzing, doing meta-analyses of different clinical trials, looking as to whether there's a, adequate representation of sex and gender ratio in clinical trials in certain diseases, and whether this reflects the epidemiology. Because if it was adequately represented at the time for thalidomide, for example, they would have seen that actually it had some potential effects on pregnancy and it would have been avoided.
Francis, I was reflecting on like an investigator bias and like not asking like all potential eligible patients to participate in clinical trials, because one of the major like barriers to a patient not enrolling in a clinical trial is that they didn't even know that there was a clinical trial. No one asked them. And I often like think about it's like what is going on in the investigator's head if they're like making assumptions about the patient without actually like raising clinical trials as an opportunity for the patient and then engaging in a conversation with the patient about the risk and the benefits up front versus like not even engaging with that discussion already. And then the patient is then like out of the running for the opportunity to participate in research from the start.
I think Jate has a question. It seems like he posted a few times. Maybe if you want to unmute.
He did, yes. I was just reading back to that. Jate, would you like to phrase your question yourself?
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, panelists. I had asked a question in the chat, and I'll read that, but then I want to elaborate on it really briefly. So basically, my question was to you, Keith, and I guess any of the other panelists that could maybe provide some clarity, but it was about your experience, you said, with the Roche study, and I just said, do you think that the experience you've seen with Roche, where there was not an increased cost associated with the conduct of that study, was isolated just to that study, and might certainly, might certain diseases potentially incur a greater cost if they're being investigated? I think you said that study was for a COVID treatment, but the speed of recruiting for indications such as an oncology setting may actually incur, different levels of cost. And what we've seen at my company actually is that there actually may be an enhanced cost to one, seeking new sites, assessing those sites, training those sites about our standards, engaging with new investigators, Also having, site liaisons who can further assist, individual participants with remaining on the study, as well as providing additional resources for translations. And so we've seen that there is, likely going to be an enhanced cost. There's not really an economic analysis to determine exactly what that is. However, we do see a number of new resources being needed to engage new sites. As you said, going to new sites is definitely the key to getting a diverse representation in our studies. However, we do think that there will be an additional cost. And I wasn't sure if you could comment on maybe if that was isolated to just the COVID indication that you studied, because it's, just a broader population that was, being assessed there, as opposed to maybe other indications where it might not be maybe a similar experience. And if you think that that is in fact the case or not.
Yeah, I think it's an active and ongoing conversation with disease teams and with study teams. And really the conversations around, costs, timelines, and trade-offs. But really it's like the focus is like, what do we want at the end of the day? What is the goal? What is the strategy? What does good look like? And for Roche Genentech, our goal is that our clinical trial demographics to be reflective of the baseline epidemiology of disease. So we are making decisions and trade-offs in order to achieve that goal. The impact of COVID example is one example of, I think it was a very unique situation because it was during the height of COVID, the trial was taking place, but actually it is an example of myth busting for that particular disease, for that particular study, that cost came in lower than anticipated because timelines were shorter. But I think this is an ongoing discussion with each study team, disease area teams are thinking about their strategy and their tactics and their budgets as we think about like how we're going to do business differently. We're engaging with sites, engaging with investigators. So I think the discussion of cost and budget is always there, and we're collecting this data, and we're going to have learnings and insights, additional learnings and insights over time. But really, like the focus and the goal is that is that our trial demographics to be reflective of the disease epidemiology. Fair
enough. Thanks so much for that. And I guess another thing to add to that is, my company is a member company of pharma, and I would just comment that I think it would be a really great activity if pharma's resource to maybe consider doing any kind of economic analysis that could help, determine any type of cost considerations between, diverse trial enhancement versus how we've been doing trials in the past, so that companies could just at least utilize that as a consideration in making some of these, key decisions, which, is not in some ways going to even be an option going forward, because I think regulators are starting to even in some ways require it, but at least so that could be considered within the financing of our trials and how we're going to have to understand that there may be some additional resources needed. But love the work you guys are doing. Thanks again.
Just to add on to your comment about regulators, it's like I think when you think about the cost for post-marketing commitments, like if the data that you submit to the regulatory authorities is, let's say it's for a disease with like a very disproportionate high impact on African-American patients, but you have no African-American patients in your clinical trial, and then you need to do a post-marketing commitment, this is additional cost and additional time and resources. So if you don't do it right during the development program, and then you're slapped with a post-marketing, post-regulatory commitment, that is additional cost and resources and time as well.
Yeah, and it would be good if Pharma could do an analysis of that too, just FYI.
Yeah, and I know ISPOR released some guidelines on diversity in clinical trials. So I know internally, we are doing some work to some of that analysis. So I could connect you internally with some individuals in that space at Pharma.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, and I know Mary and I know each other, so I can definitely reach out to you offline. Thanks.
Okay.
So thank you for your question, Jate, and for immediately giving some homework to our panelists. To your point there, Keith, so you mentioned the role of the regulators in this, and I'm quite curious about that, and maybe we can go a bit deeper into that. So what is the role of the regulator into making sure that we have the data on all the relevant subpopulations? Are they currently, how active are they currently in that space, and how much more active should we maybe want them to be?
I guess for the FDA specifically, I think they've been very active in this space, and Mary can probably say a lot more than I can about this. But just quite recently, the last few weeks, the FDA issued some draft guidance on having diversity plans in place to increase enrollment of underrepresented patients in clinical trials. So basically, so that you need to be like thinking about like your strategy and your plan and your target enrollment goals up front, and having these conversations with the FDA when you are planning your clinical development program. So I think that's a huge step forward with this draft guidance, and a huge opportunity for industry to be like thinking about their strategy and their tactics and their goals for diversity in clinical trials. And Mary, do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just as Keith had mentioned, the FDA did release a draft guidance a few weeks ago on diversity plans. Overall, I think it's a step in the right, we think it's a step in the right direction, because ultimately not only are pharmaceuticals learning and growing in the space of how to create more diverse clinical trials, the FDA is also, learning about that. So this provides an opportunity to not only develop diversity plans, but be able to communicate that information back to the FDA so that they can have a better understanding of the space and be able to provide guidance to other pharmaceutical companies. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, because not only are regulators thinking about it, but many of our member companies have done quite a bit of work on the back end, even prior to the draft guidance, to help understand how we can make clinical trials more diverse.
That's great, and I think it really exemplifies how it's an issue that really cannot be addressed by one stakeholder alone, and it's really about building those networks on all sides, be it the regulators, but also the patient organizations and the physicians to make to bring us further along into the right direction of this journey. So I have another question that I received through the chat to you, Frances. So I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it for you. It's a question by Jacob. He asks, you mentioned that you are also looking into clinical trial data to identify issues of representations. I'm doing similar analysis in Denmark in a collaboration between University of Copenhagen and the Danish Medicine Agency Data Analytics Center. If you would like to exchange notes and ideas at some point, it would be really cool. Okay, I think there's maybe not really a question in there, but it's somebody who would really like to connect with you. So we'll try to connect you with Jacob at the end of this call, and hopefully that can lead to some good projects into the future.
Yeah, that would be great. Just to give a brief overview. Thanks, Jacob. So what I was referring to is we did a meta-analysis of Alzheimer's disease trials, and we looked at all the different drugs. We ended up including like 56 RCTs into the final analysis. And what we did find is that in all of them, none of them represent the amount of females in their trials as there are in the patient population. But what was quite interesting is that the approved drugs had a higher representation of females than the non-approved drugs, even though it was still below what we would recommend to reflect really the epidemiology of the disease. But would be happy to connect offline and see what we can do.
That's great. I'm glad these connections are being made. There's maybe one area that I feel like we haven't gone into too much yet, and so relevant for both you, Keith, and Mary, as you've both been working on it. So you've both been part of working groups, respectively, for pharma and IFPMA around principles for diversity in clinical trials. So would either of you maybe care to elaborate sort of the role of these principles and the value that they can add?
Yeah, I think Keith had mentioned it prior. The role of the principals is really to provide guidance to our member companies and sponsors that are conducting clinical trials. I think we oftentimes, well, at least at pharma, we often release best practices for clinical trials. So ultimately what we want to be made aware in the landscape, or make our member companies aware of the landscape, the barriers to clinical trials, and some of the ways that they can address those barriers. Because the first step is really understanding those barriers to put together infrastructures in order to overcome them.
And for the IFPMA principles, the work stream included members. I think it was probably like 6 or 7 IFPMA member companies. We came together and over a year worked on these principles that are that really are framed as like belief statements and tied to principles of bioethics, justice, fairness, beneficence, that guide both medical practice and clinical research. And these belief statements include that we believe that diversity inclusion in clinical trials is a matter of both equity and scientific rigor. And as such, individuals should have equal opportunities to participate in clinical trials. And as IFPMA members, like, we have a responsibility to act on the need for diverse representation and inclusion in clinical trials from a global perspective. There are, for the belief principles, there are 4 principles that are highlighted in the document. So I encourage you to take a look at it. It's only, I think, like 3 pages. But just really top line is that we, as a pharmaceutical industry, that we commit to identifying barriers to participation in clinical trials, that we seek to learn and understand the specific needs and challenges of diverse groups. And I think we talked about that a little bit earlier in our conversation about, engaging with external KOLs and engaging with patient advocacy organizations. It's important to conduct clinical research in the widest range of populations, and diversity within the clinical research community is also important. I think we've hit on that a little bit during our conversation today. That it's important that it is helpful when patients go to a site and they see people that look like themselves. I think it's also helpful within the within industry that representatives from the sponsor companies, the investigators and study coordinators also reflect the wider diversity within the country or countries that are involved in research.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Mary, for helping to answer this one. So I'm going to be closing the chat very soon. There's two questions that are both around definition that have come in that I still would like to put in front of you. So the first one is around when we talk about communities, or which is the term we've used throughout this conversation. The question is that in Europe the language seems to be more on populations. So in your view and in your experience, is this really just a linguistic difference, or does it really reflect also the way that the different ways of viewing patient populations are viewed? That's one question. The second one is around whether the panel can comment and provide thoughts on the differences between the differences of race in non-US regions and the challenges for companies to have a diverse representation in multi-regional trials. Is there anybody who wants to take either one of those questions?
Maybe I'll take the first one about, it was about populations versus communities. I think probably it's linguistic. It can be used interchangeably. I don't see much of a difference, but I don't know if others do.
Yeah, I would agree that it's probably more of a linguistics issue. And so oftentimes, I know within pharma, we often use communities, and it's part of that is also breaking down the barrier between how we communicate internally across other individuals who are working in clinical trials versus the communities that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, I'm definitely no expert, but to me, subpopulation feels a bit more, sterile maybe than the term community. But that's interesting that somebody observed indeed how the different terms are sometimes used interchangeably, maybe sometimes less. So to the other question, so any thoughts from the panel on definitions of race in non-US regions and the challenges companies have with multi-regional trials?
That's a tough question. I know we've had some internal discussions, especially with the FDA guidance that was recently released regarding, because many of our member companies, if not all of them, are global companies. And so when we're thinking of diverse clinical trials, we're not only conducting trials within the US. And so we think of underserved or underrepresented populations. When you go to regions in Asia, the population is, not necessarily underrepresented. So it is a pretty difficult question. I don't have the answer to that, but there is quite a bit of discussion ongoing, especially in regards to the FDA guidance that was recently released.
Thank you, Mary. I see that Jata would maybe like to elaborate on the question. Are you happy to do that now?
Yeah, I can elaborate on this. So one of the challenges, and I think for international trials, is that there's an observed heterogeneity of populations. And so, I know Dr. Nokwedi probably has seen a lot of this in some things from pharma, but basically within, like, let's say Black patients here may not have similar experiences, similar exposures, or similar biology, biochemistry, when compared to Black patients in Africa or Europe or Canada. And I'm not sure if that has been accounted for in terms of any types of scientific data that could be generated from, any racially, diverse trials. And if there's any kind of goals to separate patients by region versus race, and if one would be considered more important, or if both would be needed, actually, in terms of really having some assessments across, both race as well as the region, in order to make sure to see if there are any differences within the conduct of our trials as well.
Yeah,
I don't know if Keith maybe or Dr. Nokwedi could comment on that, but.
Yeah, again, this topic is kind of ongoing. When we think of race and ethnicity in the US, we definitely kind of view it from a social construct because oftentimes that contributes to health outcomes, access to care, environmental impact that can ultimately affect the disease state as well as the progression. And so with that, we can't necessarily use that model and transpose it to Africa or Asia or different European nations. And so it is a very complicated issue. I think there's a lot to discuss. I don't have the answers at the moment, but I think I would love to hear others' opinions because it is, there's quite a bit to think about when we think about ethnicity and race in terms of diversity with global trials.
Yeah, I think that like just for the FDA, I think it's over like 95% of the trial data they receive. It's global data that's submitted to the FDA. And what the FDA is really interested in seeing is that like how these data relate to the US patient population. So the patients can come from anywhere in the world, but they need to have, when you think about like their screening and diagnosis and standard of care, it needs to be reflective of the US patient population to do an assessment of the ultimate efficacy and safety of the drug. That being said, there's always there's the opportunity for analyses by region. Also, you can also do analyses by patients who may have a cohort of patients who were enrolled with more expanded eligibility criteria versus more restrictive eligibility criteria. So you can see potentially the impact of these different cohorts on the efficacy and safety of the drug. So I think these are ongoing discussions for the analysis, but I think that ultimately, just talking specifically for the US and for the FDA, they want to make sure that the drug works in the U.S. Patient population. So that's the standard for assessment at the end. But I think that there is opportunity for analysis for various analysis of the data set.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it just is fairly. I agree with Dr. Mulcahy. It's fairly complicated given there's just differences in how races are reported in different countries. Like if you think of some of the Central American and even South American countries, they don't identify necessarily always consistent with how we define things in the U.S. And so just it introduces another barrier in terms of the translatability of that data. From racial and ethnic data over to how we report it here. So, but fair enough. I hear the comments and definitely appreciate it from Keith and Dr. Mulcahy. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Devin. I think with that, there's one more question that's coming in the chat that I'd like to cover. After that, we're really going to be closing the chat so we can move towards the ending of the session as well, because I see we've been having some interesting debate, but also coming towards already the end of what we have available for us on the clock today. So it's a question, I think, to Keith as well, which is referring to an earlier comment that you made around whether study investigators are actually referring certain patients into studies. So is there anything that you would recommend that can be done about that bias on the side of the investigators in terms of whether they will or will not recommend certain patients into a study based on their ethnic background?
I think part of it's awareness. it's like really, I think there's literature and data that's available today about, you know, unconscious bias, and there's also training for investigators to educate them about the concept of unconscious bias. So I think having that conversation with investigators like up front, really with the goal of is like making the investigator like aware that like for this study, like the goal is that we want to enroll patients that are reflective of the baseline epidemiology of disease. We want to enroll patients that are reflective of the community that's within your clinical site. So having that conversation up front is like, then you can talk about then like the how and how we can work together to achieve that goal. But there's resources that are available for unconscious bias training for investigators. There's literature that is available to them. But I think like simply just having that conversation about, you know, asking all eligible patients up front will go a long way.
Thank you, Keith, indeed. So with that, I think I'm going to slowly start rounding up. But before I move to a full close, maybe I would like to invite all of the panelists, if they have any final thoughts that they have to share with the audience. Maybe Francis, could I start with you? If there's anything else you want to give our audience before they go off and back into their regular day-to-day job routine.
I mean, I just wanted to thank the audience very much for their engagement and also for the very interesting discussions we've had. I feel like I've been learning a lot just from listening to what Keith and Mary were saying. It seems that there's a lot of work ahead of us, especially in terms of awareness. And I think the best way forward is really to kind of put all of our heads together, you know, industry, academia, and nonprofit organizations. So thanks again for the invitation. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you so much, Francis. Mary, would you maybe like to go next?
Yeah, and I'll probably echo much of what Francis has said. Thank you all for joining and the really engaged discussion. It's definitely webinars like this that help push this initiative forward. And again, I'm echoing what you said, Francis. This initiative will take not only one industry, so putting our heads together from different aspects of the clinical trial ecosystem ultimately will help increase diversity in clinical trials. So I'm excited to be here and glad that this occurred.
And I'm glad to be facilitating. Keith, would you have any last thoughts for our audience?
No, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate. I know that after this call, I'm going to reach out to Francis and Mary because I'm really happy that we've had this time to interact, and I see I have some additional resources that are available to me. And I also, like, for just speaking of resources, I really encourage those that are on the call to take a look at the IFPMA's clinical trial diversity principles document, because I think it's a really, it's a short read, but I think it's an important tool to help guide our strategy and tactics to increase clinical trial diversity.
Thank you, Keith. And I guess the same level of advertisement would also be relevant maybe for those with a more US focus to have a look at the pharma principles that have also been relatively recently designed with Mary, who is on the call with us today. So this is bringing us to the close of our session. I hope that everyone in our audience enjoyed these conversations that we had, maybe learned a thing or two. At least for myself, it's been very cool to be in this position to be able to ask you all these questions. I personally really was inspired by your passion that you brought into this conversation, impressed by your insights in something that's actually not nearly as easy as you might think on the surface. Multifaceted was a word well used, and indeed, if it were easy to solve, we probably had solved it already by now. So I just want to thank you for your contribution, what you're doing every day to make clinical trials a bit more diverse and helping to build those health systems that we envision that we want to have today and into the future. So before I close, I also really want to recognize Sergio Cavallero from the IFPMA Secretariat, who's actually done all of the heavy lifting for this session today. He's not on camera, but the man behind the screens who did all the heavy work. My other teammates from Hyper who helped with the preparation for the session for this one and the 2 months ago. So that's David, Michaela, Sophie, Luca, and Courtney. And finally, to everybody in the audience for coming to join us today with your interest to learn the questions that you shared. If you're interested or if you enjoyed this session, please keep an eye on the IFPMA events page where you can see future events, and also follow Hyper on social media and LinkedIn. I believe that Sergio will be dropping a link to those locations very soon. So please follow them. You will not regret it, I promise. And we'll keep coming with good content to you. So wishing you all a great day, and look forward to maybe seeing you in the future. Bye.
Bye.
Sergio, will you kick us out, or do we leave ourselves?
I think Sergio might have left. So we might have to leave for stops.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Mary. I think he's gone.
Okay, I have to hop off for another meeting. So thanks all. It's nice
All right,
meeting
well, I guess we're done. All right,
Thank you.
you. Good night.